And okay. So acquisitions for CLTs, key considerations. And I'll start by expressing solidarity with Indigenous people across Turtle Island. So the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts works on the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across so-called Canada. And so we acknowledge that we are engaging in land-based practices on stolen land and are committed to support Indigenous sovereignty and well-being through tangible actions. So supporting the development and growth of Indigenous-led CLTs, so you can take a look there. Documenting best practices for supporting reconciliation, decolonization, and land back through CLTs, and developing resources to support non-Indigenous CLTs in solidarity efforts. And there. So about the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts, our mission is to support the growth of community land trusts with the primary purpose of acquiring, developing, and or stewarding permanently affordable housing, land, and other assets that contribute to a thriving community. Our vision is of a Canadian CLT sector that is well-connected, enabled by government policy and funding, and driving a major increase in the national share of non-market housing assets. We do that through knowledge mobilization, technical assistance, movement building, and advocacy. So a few things for housekeeping. Stay muted when you're not talking. You can put questions in the chat at any time or raise your hands. You can keep your camera on or off. If you want to keep me company, put it on. And slides and resources will be sent afterwards, and we welcome feedback. A disclaimer, this is not legal advice. And a further disclaimer, I'll start by talking a little bit, a few facts that you may not know about me. So I'm Dominique Russell. I'm the research coordinator for the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. I was one of the midwives in the Kensington Market Community Land Trust project, and I'm currently the co-director of that, of the KMCLT. And so I'll be speaking within the context of that experience. Here's a few facts you may not know about me. One is, I do not have a planning background. I do not have a law background. I do not have a background in finance. In fact, I've never owned a home. I'm a lifelong renter from childhood, or my parents. I don't own a car. I've never bought anything that is really expensive. Actually, the most expensive thing I own is this beautiful painting, but it was given to me. And I have grade 10 math. I do have a PhD in Spanish literature. So if you need any reading done, I'm your person. I say this to understand that there is around this acquisition and real estate and these sort of things, a sense that you need very specialized knowledge. And there's always more that you can learn, obviously, but it is also possible for someone with grade 10 math and none of this background to understand this. And granted, there's experience, but I think that it's important to consider that if you can read, you can understand these things, that we bring knowledge that may not be specialized, but that is important to value and understand. There's a way in which you can, this specialized, all these APSs and all the codes can be very excluding. And I think something that we want to do in CLTs is bring people in, community members in to our board, people with lived experience. And in order to do that, we need to be really sensitive to the language that might be excluding people. So I'm going to try and break this down to make it as clear as possible. And I will again emphasize this is a non-expert perspective. Next week, you can come and join us for an Ask the Expert about acquisition, but I'm going to walk you through in a way that assumes that you may not have any knowledge at all. So the presentation is really, as a board member, what do you need to know to participate in decisions around acquisitions? And we'll be discussing the acquisition of existing buildings by CLT. So typically buildings for KMCLT were commercial and residential, some sort of mix or fully residential. And some of these things might be applicable to other contexts. The other thing to remember is every CLT board will have different processes about when acquisition decisions go to the board. So what's the threshold of spending? What's going to be delegated to staff? Those kind of questions might be a little different depending on a CLT. So here's the outline. What makes a good acquisition? And then the pre-acquisition phase, the due diligence, the closing period. And in that closing period, I'll have a few sort of questions to suggest some discussion. This is really informed by my experience, by some interviews that I did, and the PNLT is coming out with a document that looks at these phases perhaps a little bit differently. There's the sort of pre-project planning phase. There's different ways of naming that, but it's essentially everything that you do before you start to really try and acquire a building. So part one, what makes a good acquisition? And I'm not necessarily able to see anything in the chat, so let me know if I need to stop. So what's a good acquisition? Basically, values aligned, financed in whatever level of risk that you are able to, how much is financed, how that's financed is going to be different according to each group, and one that passes due diligence. So it means that, when you're preparing for an acquisition phase, one of the key things is making sure that you have a clear sense of your mission and of your values. So from this document from PLT on acquisition planning, the acquisition timeline. So pre-project planning, feasibility analysis, securing a site, 2 to 8 months, depending on your organizational capacity, sign an APS, an agreement of purchase and sale. The due diligence period, and I'll talk about all this in more detail, which can be 45 to 90 days. The due diligence date, the date after which you're no longer able to come out of the deal without considerable damage. The closing period, which 45 to 90 days, and then your closing date, and then your stewardship. So this is theoretically the acquisition timeline. Thinking this through, I came up with this acquisition timeline in practice. So you've got your search for a suitable property. I know you're not going to be able to see all the details here, but so you find one, and then too late, it's sold, back to searching for a suitable property. Just in time, you make an offer, the seller doesn't accept it, back to your search. You're accepted, you sign an APS, you can't come up with a deposit, you go back to searching for a suitable property, then appraisal, the property might be overvalued, hardly ever happens, but you go back, search for a suitable property. You do a title search, you find out that there's some lien on the property, there's some issue with the title, so you go back to search for a suitable property. So there's all kinds of ways in which what I want you to notice is the forest of arrows that are heading towards going back to search for a suitable property, and relatively few arrows that come towards you've bought a building. So we tend to think of these as, we talk about failed acquisitions, but in actual fact, when this is the due diligence period, when you're looking at the title search, your building condition, your code, your environmental site assessment, all these analysis of whether it's a good property or not. What is actually the failed acquisition is the one where you buy a building and you're not able to manage it properly. But the process of trying to find a suitable property and getting to where you've bought the building. There's going to be a lot of times where you just go back to keep searching. So I actually wanted to do this like as a board game. And if anyone want, there could be like the CLT game, because Celia was saying it's like this game of snakes and ladders where you keep going down. But there's a game in here somewhere. Anyway, this is the initial sketch. But just to get the idea that it's not a simple linear process. So your pre-acquisition phase. The first thing is to clarify your priorities and values. Now, most CLTs will have done this in the initial setting up of the CLT, but when it comes to the actual acquisition, there's a kind of clarification that's inevitably going to happen because your priorities and your values are not, you're not going to be able to bring them all into one project. So you're really, it's the test of where you're figuring out which of these is the most important. So there's almost like a second process that happens when of these priorities and values that you may have established through your in the initial phase of setting up this CLT become really solidified in the acquisition process. Know your boundaries. Now, that can be geographical. They can be sort of what is the imaginary geography. But also, again, I use this example, the Kim CLT, we have very defined boundaries. We're a small neighborhood in downtown Toronto, Spadina, Bathurst, College, and Dundas, clearly within that's Kensington Market. But when we were in one of our a property came up outside of our boundaries while we were doing this continual kind of search. And so suddenly it's like, that's a great building and our members could live there and walk into the Kensington Market. So maybe we need to expand our boundaries. So again, the process of searching for a building to acquire can be a very clarifying one in terms of, you might need to sort of shift things that you had thought about. And then the key question, what funding is available? Without funding, this is an imaginary exercise, which is important in and of itself. But what funding is available? What might you do? You might be wanting to align your acquisition with funding opportunities. That doesn't always happen, but if you need to be thinking about when funding might be coming in. So for example, in Toronto, we have the multi-unit residential acquisition program, something like that, and you can use your application for these funding programs as a test run. Is it going to work? And then the question of how are you planning on managing the building? And again, until you have a concrete idea of what's available, what's possible, and really maybe until you're thinking we need to get this building, you might not have thought through what it is to manage the building. But you want to consider values alignment when you're weighing partnerships and how you might proceed with managing the building. And I was at a conference this week, and somebody was saying that the best way to destroy a nonprofit is to dump a building on them, which really struck me because actually managing the building is so much more complicated than the excitement around acquiring. So that really needs to be thought through. Determine the priorities of your organization. So what are your needs? Housing needs of your members, your community. What is it what are the at-risk buildings, and who are the people that you are really trying to house, or what is it that you're the need of your community? What are the boundaries of your geography? So again, that can be physical boundaries. That could be also who your members are, and more loosely if you have more. If you're not a neighborhood organization, that conversation might get more complicated. Who are your users? It could be who your members are, who are going to be your users. But if you're like us, commercial, you have a commercial side or a mixed use CLT, then the question of users might be, what retail are you bringing in? So those kinds of questions. What are some possible partnerships, and start to explore those? And obviously, what are the possibilities for financing? And Celia, stop me if there's a question in the chat that I need to be looking at.
No questions, just some
Okay.
chatter, yeah.
Great. Chatter away. So when considering acquisition, I think there needs to be this balance between your long-term vision and the urgency of the present. So there is an urgency. We are in a housing emergency. And so there is an urgency of finding ways that we can, at least to some small extent, house our community. The need to distinguish a once-in-a-generation opportunity from one more manifestation of the crisis. There is also the urgency of the real estate market itself, and there's an ebb and flow there. But there can be kinds of pressures that you get this building, you either get it or you don't get it, and that's it's in a rapid time frame. So that's another pressure that needs to be considered, and so that's why it's so good to be thinking through the planning beforehand, but also to be ready to jump. And there is this. I don't know what the balance is. I'm just saying we need to really be thinking about it. Sometimes things just come together. So this is the Kensington Market Community Land Trust building that we acquired in 2021, 5456 Kensington Ave. And it was clearly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There was no question. And this is because we had helped organize the tenants. It was an at-risk building. There was a big risk of displacement. It's an iconic building, the Mona Lisa, the punks on the stoop. It's one of the few apartment buildings in our neighborhood. It had commercial and residential. So it just very clearly fit the mission of the organization, the values, and it was we had our eye on it as a key building. So sometimes it's just really, really clear, and you can feel it in your gut. But sometimes it's useful sometimes it's not so clear. And this is an example of an acquisition priorities matrix that that Celia actually made for another group to kind of think through what types of acquisition, really walking through decisions in terms of priorities. And you could use this to compare different types of buildings, different buildings, and see which one fits. So I've just done a sort of draft for what the KMCLT might be. So what's ideal, what's possible, and what's a no-go, and what are some of the considerations based on location, building type and use, users, the operating model, financial sustainability, and priorities of ownership model. So for us, location, Kensington Market, possible just outside, a few blocks away. The balance between residential and commercial for us will be important. What the building type, mixed commercial, residential apartment buildings in Kensington Market. Then there's some others that, each of these, you can use this matrix for your own CLT. Each one will be different. Users, low-income tenants, current renters, which is possible. What's a no-go is homeowners, except that maybe we'll eventually be thinking about shared equity in the future. Operating model, we would love to have our own KMCLT-led property management firm. Possible is a partnership. We're not going to be doing head leases to private corporations or using extractive property managers or partners. In terms of financial sustainability, so the ideal is when the operating revenues are sufficient to carry the building and there's a small surplus, or debt coverage ratio of more than 1.1%, and I'll talk about that in a sec. or when there's enough to carry the building is possible, but we would never go for something that had an operating deficit. And with the ownership model, so if we own it in perpetuity, that's the ideal. It's possible a long-term lease if we're looking at stewardship. A no-go would be when the property is not secured long-term. So that's a sort of draft of what we would be thinking about, and then we could take each property as it appears, and maybe there's a decision between 3 properties, and we can sort of use this matrix to see which one makes the most sense to go for. So in order to do that, you've got to map your acquisition possibility. And sometimes opportunity knocks. So somebody comes to you and says, hi, I want to give you my building. And yeah, that's great. And that's pretty rare, but that can happen. Or maybe you're in a relationship. Hopefully you are developing these relationships so that a homeowner comes to you and says, or a building owner, property owner says, I want to sell you my building. So that's one way. But the other is working with a real estate agent. And it's a good idea to start doing that fairly early on to, again, get a real clear sense of what might be available. Now, finding a real estate agent. This I did not know because the KMCLT, when we did our first acquisition, we didn't in fact have staff at that time, but we had a whole lot of support. We did get staff in the end from, again, a partnership that had been set up. The Affordable Housing Project got us our first staff so that we could, on contract, so that we could do all that needed to be done to acquire the building. But very much the help of the PNLT. They loaned us a lot of the people that they work with. And so that's one of the beauties of the network, is that you will have access to some of these that we can share our understanding of who these professionals are that work well. But if you're looking for a real estate agent, this is from the PNLT's planning acquisition planning document, which will be available soon. But so you're looking for a certain type of property, you might do a neighborhood scan, search online for a particular type of property. You're a certain geography, you're walking around, you're looking at the signs, which agent is doing what. If you're not sure where to start, you might perform a search of all the real estate companies and meet with them, explain your needs and purpose. Once you've established contact with at least 3 agents, you can review their materials, the resume, their references, testimonials, arranging a face-to-face. How does it feel to be working with that person? And it's really important that your agent understands your mission and has a strong reputation, and that you feel comfortable working with that person, including being able to ask lots and lots of questions, because again, the real estate world is full of all this jargon, and you need to be able to say, I need you to explain this to me simply. Say that we're very happy with the real estate agent that we have, and one thing that he understands quite well about our mission is what when to reveal who we are and when not, because not all property owners are going to be friendly to CLT. So it's good to have an understanding of that subtlety. This is an example of the listings. So your agent will likely send you a series of listings, and so you have a sense of what's out there. Now, the financial considerations. So thinking about financing, funding, what performers are, the capital stack, the debt service ratio. So I just threw out these words because these are the intimidating words for me as somebody without any of that kind of background. Debt service ratio, coverage ratio. So it's how much debt you have and singles the health of your organization. So, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, divided by interest and principal, so how much you're paying. So what's your financial health? How much do you owe in relationship to what you're going to be making? So that's a key kind of measure that banks are going to be looking at. This is an example of a pro forma. So lots of numbers and And to some extent, board members have to have some understanding of this, and I'll make it, I'll break it down. So first, what's the building? What are you looking at? So how big is it? How many units? What's the AMR, the average market rent? So generally, you're going to be trying to get to 80% of what the average market rent for your area is. So what's the building? Is there parking? Is there just generally what it is you're looking at? What's the current rent? What's the proposed rent? What's the space? What does that look like? So first element. How much is it? So the property value, so the cost is going to include things like the environmental assessment, land transfer tax, the building condition assessment, we'll talk about in a sec, an appraisal, and then all these soft costs, legal fees, municipal approval and permits, site plan applications, building fee permits, district school board charges, consultant fees, landscapes, mortgage insurance fees. There's a whole host of soft costs, so things that aren't the actual building, that also need to be calculated. So you don't have to do that calculation. Usually you'll hire somebody or you have staff that will do this, but you need to be able to at least be able to read through it and get some understanding. What financing, what funding is available? So where are you going to get the money? What's the total cost? What funding is available? What financing can you get? And again, this is going to change every time, your mortgage, your what you end up paying. So this capital stack, as they call it, this will change with each, depending on a host of factors. But the question is, can you afford to buy it? So how much money is it going to cost all in, and what money is available? And so you're, as a board member, this is really what you're going to be looking at. And I know this is fictional, it doesn't actually add up, but it should add up. So these are the numbers that anything that you really don't understand, you should be able to ask 1,000 questions. And I'll say as well, there was one acquisition attempt, and I just couldn't get my head around where the money was coming from. And so I'd think I'd have a handle on it, and then I'd go back, and then I couldn't get a clear sense of it. And what I've learned is, because I always think, oh, that's just me, I don't understand it. But what I learned was that there were so many shifting pieces. In the end, it wasn't solid enough. And so sometimes your instinct that you don't really get it, it's possible that it has to do with the actual way it's being put together. So the next question is, so maybe you can afford to buy it. Can you afford to run it? Is another. So how much money is coming in to cover operating costs? So what's the revenue? And you'll have it broken down by units and what's it costing as well, maintenance, pest control, a whole host of things, including a contingency, your insurance, management fees, property taxes. And then you've got an operating budget. So what's the revenue and what are the expenses? And is there any surplus? So again, where a board is, what a board member is really looking at is this kind of summary of what a deal is going to look like. So let's say it's a fit, or it's nearly a fit. There might still be some, some pieces of the financing puzzle that you need to keep working on, but you make an offer. And so in making an offer, you sign an agreement of purchase and sale, which it's the APS. So some of you might know that our director, Nat Pace, is really keen on getting a CLT on the moon. So this is an agreement of purchase and sale. to buy the moon from the master of the universe. So you've got the buyer, the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts, the seller from master of the universe, description of the property, fronting, so the moon fronting on the dark side of the moon in the universe, et cetera, a purchase price, what the deposit is, and a few details that I'll come back to. So chattels, I did not know this. This is the things that you can take away. So in case of the moon, it's the dust and Buzz Aldrin's boot print. The fixtures are the things that you can't move. So the doors to eternity are fixed. And then some rental items, satellite debris, moon garbage, and things like that, the HST. This is the key. So you agree to pay the balance. So one thing that I didn't know when we were attempting to put an offer, an APS for 5456, is that you have to come up with a deposit, 10% of the purchase price. So that's one thing. You put down your deposit, find the money, and then you that offer will be irrevocable at a certain date. So you're in your due diligence period as you're finding out whether the building is worth actually buying in that due diligence period. Because if you find out after that irrevocable date, then you lose your deposit, which is the completion date. So welcome to the due diligence period. The next steps will include, this is where you're starting to spend money, and generally a board, if not involved in before signing the APS, will certainly be involved at this point because your organization will be spending money. So you'll be spending money on an appraisal, a title search, a BCA, building condition assessment, an ESA, environmental site assessment, and a code consultant report. So professional appraisal opinion, is it worth the asking price? Now, generally the answer is yes. Almost all appraisals come to the price that's being asked, but that's a whole other conversation. But then you've got your title search. So is there a lien on the property? Is there an owner dispute? Is there an encumbrance? That is there someone other than the owner that can make a claim on the property after you've bought it? So that's the importance of the title search. Then the building condition assessment. So is there anything wrong with the building? What are the repair recommendations? What are the costs associated to those repairs? So you're really looking at, again, you're going to get an expert opinion about the building condition. And it's most importantly, its deficiency. So is there something that you're going to need to repair right away? Is there structural problem? Is there things that aren't obvious that make the building problematic? Then there's the code report. Is it up to code? So is there something in the building that doesn't meet the minimum standards of the building code and that you might need, in fact, to repair right away? And CLTs, like this might not be an issue if you were, you're buying the building as a private citizen, as it were, or you're a private company. But for a CLT, this is going to be really important because you hold yourself to a higher standard for your community. Environmental site assessment. So is there contamination? Is there something environmental, some contamination that will cause liability? So in this due diligence period, you're really looking at all the elements of the building so that when you buy it, there aren't any surprises. Then concurrently, you're going to find the money. So hopefully you've already started and you're trying to nail it down. So you really need in this due diligence period to be getting to where you can actually nail the money down during the closing period. So when you look at funding, your capital stack, which is such a fancy word, but anyway. So mortgage, government funding, grants, donations, community bonds, whatever it is that that can help you buy the building. So when you've done the you know, the due diligence, and you have close enough confirmation of funding, the board is going to decide whether to waive conditions or not. And if you waive conditions, it means that you were proceeding with the sale. If you waive conditions, you are essentially saying you're going through with the deal. And if you were to get out of the deal after that, during the closing period, then you're going to be losing your deposit, which will be a considerable sum of money. So all of those things that I've shown you that you'll be looking at, that's what the board is looking at to decide whether or not to waive conditions. So what are the questions you might be asking? So are there any unknowns about the building? And hopefully they're not, because you've done a complete you know, building condition assessment. Who's living there now? So who are there people there already? You know, you'll know that through the again, through what is the building, the pro forma part, where, you know, the tenants, are there existing tenants? Those kinds of questions. If there aren't people there now, then, you know, then you're thinking about who your users are, who are you going to plan to bring. If it's a commercial space, then that question becomes more complicated. It's a cultural space. You also might, you know, there might not be someone there, but you have to know who is going to be using the space. So what risks did the building condition assessment reveal? So what's the timeline? What are the costs? What are the things that need to be fixed? And you'll be asking questions based, again, on this building condition report, building condition assessment report. And it's okay to ask really specific questions about that, because, again, you don't want there to be any surprises. And certainly the role of the board is to be this sort of cautionary second sight. So what if if one of the funding pieces in the capital stack doesn't come through? So what are the contingencies for financing? And again, you want to make sure that that is going to be solid enough to go through with the deal. So the closing period. Lawyers and signatures and papers. So there's lots and lots of sort of whereas and therefores and a whole host of things that your lawyer will be putting in front of you, and you will read them carefully and have a sense of them. I was looking through 54, 56 are in our folder, the closing documents, and there's so many of them. And I did read them at the time and they make sense, but then I've forgotten them all. But anyway, there's lots of sort of signing of these official documents. And again, depending on whether if you're the board chair, then you'll likely be signing them. And if you're not, then you'll be, you know, looking through them. So congratulations, you bought a building, and now the work really begins, because the difficult part possibly is that work of stewardship, and certainly the really important part, and looking towards the future. So remember, dear board member, you're acting on expert advice. So you need to understand the advice, but you don't actually have to become the expert. So you need to be able to read and understand, but not necessarily have all the expertise. You need to be able to ask questions and understand when people, you know, what people are talking about. But you are not the expert. You are providing that community input into these questions, and bringing fiduciary responsibility. So your responsibility as a board member is this fiduciary relationship. So you have a duty of care and you have a duty of loyalty to be competent. It's not defined, but competent, informed, to act with diligence, to act in accordance with a particular standard of care. So you're acting in a reasonable way on behalf of the organization. So that's the duty of loyalty, to act honestly, to act in good faith, in the best interests of the organization. You can't profit yourself, so you're avoiding conflict of interest and you're maintaining confidentiality. But that competence isn't that you are an expert in real estate or that you are an expert in finance, but just that you have, because otherwise we won't be able to have community members on our board, right? That people with lived experience might not have this very middle class kind of understanding of legalese, for example. All of these things, real estate, legalese, these are kind of they are barriers to, you know, really democratic processes. So it's the container in which we find ourselves, and we really need to be aware of them, but they shouldn't become barriers, I think, for our organization. So there's an element of really democratizing this understanding, taking these fancy words and putting them into words that people can understand. And that is competence, right? Is to be able to understand, but to understand in layman's terms what is being explained to you in possibly very not layman's terms. So these to be aware of the way that language is competence is understanding things the way an average person would understand things. So risks. I wanted to talk a little bit about risk because the board has this fiduciary responsibility to in some way protect the organization from undue risk. But there is no acquisition that doesn't involve risk. Action is risk. But even inaction in the context of a housing crisis also has risk. Inaction can have reputational risk for the organization. So what is the balance of risk? Every CLT is going to have to struggle with that. There's no one answer. And so the board needs to understand the merits and constraints of a particular acquisition in terms of risks and rewards. And the CLT, so the CLT risk calculation, it has to involve community. It's not just the financial. And so when we think about, this is a quote from Sam Carter-Shemai, who's saying, you know, it's a tough balance to strike in terms of thinking about the composition of your board, because we often sort of reach for, you know, real estate experts, financial expert. We look to experts, and I'm not saying it's not a good idea to have experts on your board, but if you only have experts on your board, then you might not have this this community side of things. In the same way, you might not have lived experience, tenants, that sort of people who are at risk, the most vulnerable people. So it's a tough balance to strike. You need to have, you know, to read the quote, if you only cater to the activist side, you might bloat the budget. But if you only look at the financial, you might lose an opportunity. So there is this risk calculation is, I just want to insert the idea that this, within that risk, there is the housing crisis, the urgency of the housing crisis. And within that, what complicates it is also the sort of emergency mode of the real estate market, which may be shifting and does shift, but that's going to add a layer of complication to your to these decisions. So my sources, so informed by interviews with Sean Campbell from Union Sustainable Development Cooperative, Sam Carter-Shemai from who used to be with the Neighborhood Land Trust, Mike Dultis from the Ottawa Community Land Trust, and particularly Kevin Barrett from the KMCLT that I work very closely with, and Zach Bradley from the KMCLT, who made the sort of fictional the fictional pro formas so that I could kind of explain it without going into any details that I wasn't allowed to share for, confidentiality reasons. So there, before we go to the questions, there's an upcoming event next week for acquisition for CLTs, Ask an Expert. So there'll be a brief acquisition 101 led by the CNCLT. And so the steps involved in carrying out an acquisition project, going more in detail than what I've presented from a board perspective. And the rest of the time will be a Q&A with 3 CLT practitioners experienced in leading acquisitions. So come prepared with your questions. And advocate, this is really important, particularly if you're in Ontario, but advocate for acquisition funding, because that is the key. And I say this every time, but I don't think that it can be repeated enough, is that governments have the responsibility to house their citizens. We are doing the work that governments really should be doing. We can't do it without that investment. And so don't ever let anyone tell you that the government is doing us favors. That's their responsibility. So advocate for housing acquisition funding, contact your provincial housing minister, your MPP, participate in provincial and municipal budgeting processes. Ottawa, Ontario, and Toronto members, Celia sent you an email. Please follow the steps there. Share your ask via social media. Contact us to let us know your thoughts. And there are other ways that you can take action, and we'll send that to you. And now I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you and get some questions and or thoughts. So